Sometimes life doesn't just take something away. It strips you of everything you thought you could rely on. That's exactly what happened to Emma Reed, a 28-year-old waitress who lost her job, her apartment, and her sense of direction. With no one left to turn to, she drove back to her late grandmother's abandoned cabin in the mountains of Montana. The place was crumbling walls cracked the roof, leaking rooms filled with dust and silence. Everyone said it was too far gone. But Emma saw something different. One day at a time, one room at a time, she began to rebuild not just the cabin, but her faith. And what she found inside wasn't just an old house, it was a miracle waiting to be uncovered. This story reminds us that sometimes God doesn't remove the storms.
Welcome to Nora's
He
Table.
rebuilds us
Please
through
come
them.
in. Be
Tell me
kind,
in the comments
be fed,
where you're
be
watching
home.
from, and if this story touched your heart, subscribe for more stories of hope and redemption. And if you believe that God can turn ruins into blessings, write amen in the comments. The late autumn rain had followed Emma Reed all the way from Portland to the northern hills of Montana. By the time she reached the first curve of the mountain road, the drizzle had turned to sleet, streaking the windshield in sharp silvery lines. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, the kind of color that seemed to leach warmth from everything beneath it. Her old Ford pickup, a 1999 model, the color of faded sea foam, groaned each time the wheels hit another patch of gravel. She had driven nearly 9 hours with nothing but a duffel bag, a coffee thermos gone cold, and the gnawing silence that came after losing everything she thought was stable. Emma was 28 with soft brown hair that she usually tied into a low ponytail for work, and pale skin freckled from years of waitressing under the neon glare of diner lights. Her eyes were hazel warm, but dulled now by exhaustion. There was a time when she laughed easily, the kind of laugh that could fill a room. But months of scraping by in Portland had worn her down. The closing of the Silver Spoon Diner, a small family-owned place where she'd spent 5 years serving coffee and learning the habits of strangers, had been the last straw. No paycheck meant no rent meant eviction. And so, with nowhere left to go, she drove toward a place she hadn't seen in over 15 years, her grandmother Nora's cabin, deep in the pine-covered valleys of Clearwater County. The rain thinned to a mist as the road climbed higher. Pines lined both sides, their dark needles dripping. A deer darted across the path and vanished into the fog. Emma slowed, watching the world shrink behind her in the rearview mirror. Portland, her old life, her apartment filled with second-hand furniture, all dissolving into distance. When she finally turned onto the dirt road that led to Nora's old property, her hands tightened on the wheel. The cabin came into view, like a ghost half swallowed by forest. The wooden siding had darkened to the color of ash. The roof sagged in the middle, weeds and wildflowers tangled around the porch. The windows were clouded with grime, and one of the shutters hung loose, swaying gently in the wind. The sight twisted something in her chest, nostalgia mixed with grief. This was the place where she'd spent summers chasing fireflies, where her grandmother's voice had once filled the air with lullabies and the scent of baked bread. Emma killed the engine and stepped out into the cold air. Her boots sank slightly into the wet earth. The silence here was vast, broken only by the occasional cry of a crow and the whisper of the wind through the trees. For a moment she stood still, her breath clouding in front of her. Then she climbed the porch steps, each one creaking like a complaint. The front door resisted when she pushed it, had swollen from years of moisture, but finally gave way with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old memories. Light filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, turning the dust motes into tiny drifting stars. Furniture sat under yellowed sheets, and the faint smell of cedar lingered under the scent of mildew. A framed photo on the wall caught her eye. A younger Nora standing in front of the cabin, a broad smile on her weathered face. She'd been a small, strong woman with bright blue eyes and hands always busy with something kneading dough, fixing fences, or writing in that little leather journal she kept on her nightstand. Emma whispered, "Hi, Grandma." The sound of her own voice startled her. It had been so long since she'd said those words. She dropped her bag near the doorway and started opening windows, letting the damp air out. Cobwebs stretched across corners. The floorboards groaned under her steps. The place was worse than she remembered, but there was still something alive in it, something quietly waiting. In the kitchen, she found an old enamel kettle sitting on the stove, its white surface chipped and rusted. Beside it, stacked neatly under a layer of dust, were the ceramic plates with blue daisies that her grandmother had loved. She ran her hand over them, tracing the familiar pattern. A lump formed in her throat. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than numbness. She spent the next few hours sweeping stacking broken chairs and airing out the rooms. Outside, the gray sky deepened into indigo, and the forest began to hum with the sound of nightfall crickets, the far-off call of an owl, the whisper of wind pushing through pines. Exhaustion tugged at her limbs, but she pushed on, unwilling to sleep, in the dark silence of an unlit house. It was while cleaning the small bedroom at the back, her grandmother's old room, that she found the journal. It was tucked inside the bottom drawer of the nightstand, wrapped in an old scarf. The leather cover was cracked, the edges worn smooth by decades of use. She sat on the bed, which creaked softly beneath her, and opened it. The first page was dated June 12th, 1964. Today, we finished laying the foundation. Tom says the earth here is good solid. I believe him. This will be our home, no matter what the winters bring. Emma smiled faintly. Tom had been her grandfather, a quiet man who died before she was born. The next pages were filled with small notes about the land, the crops they'd planted, the weather, and every so often a line about faith. You don't build with wood and nails, you build with will. As she read, something stirred in her chest. Her grandmother's handwriting was strong, looping alive. There was pride in every line, the pride of someone who had built her life with her own hands. Emma read for nearly an hour before the words began to blur. She closed the journal and pressed it against her heart. "Maybe I can do this," she whispered. "Maybe I can make it stand again." The sound of gravel crunching outside broke her thoughts. She froze. Through the window, headlights flickered between the trees. She stepped to the porch, clutching her jacket tighter around her. A pickup truck rolled to a stop at the end of the path. The driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out, his outline cut against the beam of his headlights. He looked to be in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered with sun-browned skin and dark blonde hair streaked with silver at the temples. His beard was trimmed close, and his clothes denim jacket, flannel shirt, worn work boots, carried the scent of sawdust and cold air. When he spoke, his voice was deep but cautious, like someone who'd learned to measure every word. "You lost?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "No. I used to live here. My grandmother was Nora Whitfield." Recognition softened his features. "You're Nora's granddaughter." She nodded. He stepped closer, extending a calloused hand. "Jack Miller. I run the lumber yard down in town. Used to help your grandmother haul supplies up here when she was fixing the roof. Hardest woman I ever met." Emma shook his hand, noting the roughness of his palm hands that had known work, real work. His eyes were gray like storm clouds. "I didn't know she had any family left around here," he added. "Just me," Emma said quietly. "I didn't plan on coming back, but life sort of decided for me." Jack nodded, looking past her at the cabin. "Place has seen better days. Roof's in trouble, and those porch beams will give you splinters if you breathe too hard near them." She almost laughed. "I noticed." He smiled, just a flicker, but it warmed his face. "Well, if you need lumber or advice, come by the yard. I don't charge for either." She hesitated. "Thanks, I might take you up on that." He tipped his cap and returned to his truck. The engine started with a rumble, and the taillights disappeared into the trees. Emma watched until the sound faded completely. The forest settled again. She went back inside, lit a single candle she'd found in a drawer, and placed it beside the journal. The flickering light painted the walls in gold and shadow. She sat at the table staring at the faded photograph of Nora on the wall, the woman who had built this house with grit and love and bare hands. Outside, the sleet had stopped. The moon, pale and cold, rose above the treetops, washing the valley in silver. Emma took a slow breath. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, soft but steady. "You don't quit, Emmy. You fix what's broken." For the first time in a long while, she felt the faint pulse of purpose. She didn't know how she'd do it, how she'd pay for materials, how she'd handle winter, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going back to nowhere. She was already there, and she was going to make it mean something. She opened the journal again, turned to the blank page at the back, and wrote November 2nd. "I came home today. The house is broken, but maybe fixing it will fix me too." The candlelight trembled as if agreeing. Outside, in the vast quiet of the Montana woods, a wolf howled somewhere far away. Emma looked toward the window and whispered, "Tomorrow we start." Morning arrived pale and cold, with a thin veil of frost coating the pine needles and the old porch boards. The air smelled of smoke and wet soil, the scent of Montana's deep woods after rain. Emma Reed woke wrapped in a blanket too thin for the mountain chill, her breath visible in the dim light leaking through the cracks of the boarded windows. For a long moment she lay still, listening to the quiet heartbeat of the forest beyond the walls, distant crows whined scraping across bark, and the faint creak of the house settling, as if exhaling after a long sleep. The first day had taken everything from her strength, nerves, hope, but this morning felt different. Maybe it was the journal still lying open on the nightstand beside her, its ink faded but alive. Maybe it was the way the cabin, though old and broken, seemed to whisper that it still had purpose. She rose, pulled on her boots, and began her slow ritual of bringing the house back to life. The kitchen was her first battleground. Dust blanketed everything: tables, shelves, jars. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began to scrub. It took nearly an hour to uncover the faded pattern of blue roses on the old wallpaper. Under the sink, she found a small family of field mice that scattered at her touch. She laughed softly. "Guess we're all squatters here." By noon she had filled 3 trash bags with broken dishes, torn curtains, and old newspapers. Beneath the sink, behind a loose board, her fingers brushed metal cold and unexpected. She pulled out a small tin box. Its red paint chipped the latch rusted shut. On the lid was a name carved faintly by hand: Nora Whitfield, 1967. Emma's pulse quickened. She pried the latch open with a butter knife and found inside a bundle of letters tied with string yellowed with age. The envelopes were addressed, but never sent. She lifted the first one carefully and read, "To anyone who needs a place to rest someday, this house will be open for you. No one will be turned away hungry." The next letter was the same, addressed not to a person, but to a dream. One said, "If I can't build a world that's kind, I can at least build one room that is." Another was signed simply, "For the Wanderers." Emma sat back against the counter, her eyes burning. Her grandmother hadn't just built a home. She'd built hope in wooden walls and unmailed words. "You wanted this to be a shelter," Emma murmured, folding the letters carefully. "Maybe it still can be." By afternoon, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Emma climbed onto a chair to fix a curtain rod, and that was when the ceiling groaned. The sound was deep, like a slow, painful breath. She froze. Another creak, louder this time. Then a piece of plaster fell and burst at her feet in a white puff of dust. The roof above the kitchen sagged slightly, and the beam gave a low moan. She dropped the hammer and backed away. Oh no. No, no, no. By the time she made it outside, flakes of snow had begun to fall thin and swirling. She grabbed her phone, no signal. She stood in the yard for a long moment, staring at the sagging roofline. Pride wanted to keep her there to fix it herself, but the beam could collapse any minute, and stubbornness wouldn't hold it up. She sighed and climbed into her truck. The drive to town took 20 minutes down winding forest roads, the tires sloshing through mud. Clearwater was small. One main street, a post office, a feed store, a gas station, and the Miller & Sons lumberyard, its sign painted in faded green. She pulled into the lot, where sawdust mixed with snow. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar. Jack Miller stood at the counter, talking to a man with a clipboard. When he saw Emma, he looked genuinely surprised. "Back already," he said. "The roof's caving in," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I think one of the beams is cracked. I don't know what to do." The man with the clipboard, tall mid-50s, wearing a plaid coat and a friendly grin, looked between them. "Another roof gone bad, Jack." "You got a fan club." "Not now, Rick," Jack muttered. Then to Emma, "You're lucky it didn't fall on you." "I don't feel lucky," she said quietly. He studied her for a moment, the tired eyes, the dust-streaked cheeks, the stubborn line of her jaw, and something in his expression softened. "All right, I'll come take a look. But I can't promise miracles. The old place has been empty for decades." "Miracles would be nice," she said, forcing a smile. Rick, the other man, chuckled. "Jack here doesn't believe in miracles, miss." "But he sure knows how to build one." Jack shot him a look, then grabbed his tool belt. "Let's go." Back at the cabin, the snow had thickened, falling in slow, silent flakes. Jack examined the kitchen ceiling with practiced eyes. "Beams split along the grain," he said finally. "I can brace it for now, but you'll need to replace it before winter really hits. Got any lumber? Just some rotten planks behind the shed." He sighed. "All right, I'll bring some from the yard. In the meantime, help me hold this up." For the next hour they worked side by side, wedging a temporary brace beneath the beam. Emma's arms ached, her fingers numb, but she didn't complain. Jack moved with quiet precision, every motion deliberate. He explained each step, how to check the alignment, where the nails should go, how to tell if the wood was still sound. "You've done this before?" she said between breaths. "Yeah," he replied. "Used to build houses?" "Before." She wanted to ask before what, but the heaviness in his tone told her not to. They worked in silence until the beam was secure. When it was done, Jack stepped back and nodded. "That'll hold for now." "Thank you," she said. "Really?" He shrugged. "You can pay me back by helping at the yard. The saw's been acting up. If you've got steady hands, I could use them." "I can handle that," she said. The next morning, Emma showed up at the lumberyard wearing borrowed gloves and an old flannel shirt. Jack's shop was a world of its own, sawdust floating in sunbeams, the steady hum of tools, the scent of pine and oil. She met Maggie Torres, the yard's accountant, a short, sturdy woman in her 40s with curly black hair and a motherly warmth that filled the room. Maggie gave Emma a thermos of coffee and a smile that reached her eyes. "Don't mind Jack," she whispered. "He pretends to be grumpy, but he'd give you the shirt off his back if you asked." "Good to know," Emma said, smiling. By afternoon, she had fixed the jam saw and swept half the shop. Jack watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a ghost of amusement tugging at his lips. "Didn't think you'd last an hour," he said. "I'm full of surprises," she replied. That evening, back at the cabin, she lit the lantern and pulled the tin box closer. The letters still smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She decided to store them safely in the kitchen cabinet. But as she slid the box into place, her knee bumped the floorboard beneath her. It gave a hollow sound, not the solid thud of wood against earth. Frowning, she set the lamp down and pressed again. Hollow. She fetched a screwdriver and pried the board loose. Beneath was a dark gap, the air rising from it cold and stale. She lifted the lamp and peered inside. A narrow wooden stair led down into darkness. Her pulse quickened. She descended carefully, the steps creaking. The air smelled of dust and old metal. At the bottom, she found a cramped cellar lined with shelves of canned goods, long spoiled, and on a table covered by a moth-eaten cloth, a small chest. Inside were relics, a rusted army canteen dog, tags a child's shoe, and a folded letter written in the same looping hand as her grandmother's. The letter ended mid-sentence. If they find out about the boy, and then nothing. Emma stood in the dim light, heart pounding. The boy, she whispered. The cellar seemed to echo her words back to her, soft and uncertain, a secret waiting to be unearthed. The morning after she discovered the hidden cellar, Emma Reed woke with a strange heaviness pressing at her chest. The letter had haunted her dreams, its unfinished line. If they find out about the boy, circling in her mind like a whisper that refused to fade. She sat on the edge of her bed, the cold wood against her bare feet, staring at the gray light filtering through the thin curtains. The air smelled faintly of pine and old wood smoke, and beneath that, something deeper, the scent of questions left unanswered. After breakfast, stale crackers, and instant coffee, she went back down to the cellar. She carried a small flashlight this time, sweeping its beams slowly across the stone walls. The shelves were lined with relics of another life, tin cans, oil lamps, and a rusted sewing machine whose wheel still turned when she nudged it. But the small chest on the table was what held her. The folded letter lay exactly where she had left it. She read the words again and again, hoping new meaning would appear between the faded lines. The boy, she whispered aloud. Who was he? And why had her grandmother never mentioned him? That afternoon, she drove into Clearwater to visit the county records office, a squat brick building beside the post office. Inside the clerk, a middle-aged woman named Nancy Caldwell, with short blonde hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, looked up from her computer and smiled with polite curiosity. Nancy was the kind of woman who had spent her whole life in one town and knew everyone's story by heart. Her voice was soft but efficient, her smile tinged with the brisk confidence of someone who had been holding the community's secrets for decades. I'm looking for records, Emma said. Old ones, from the 1940s, maybe the 1950s, the Whitfield property out near Hollow Creek. Nancy adjusted her glasses and typed quickly. That'd be Nora Whitfield, right? Lived there till, let's see, 1989, if I remember right. That's her, Emma said. I found something in her house, a letter about a boy, someone she might have hidden. The woman's fingers hesitated over the keys. Hidden, honey, that was wartime. People hid all kinds of things, then ration goods soldiers, even babies. Let's take a look. Nancy disappeared into the back room and returned with a thick binder labeled County Foster and Adoptions, 1940 to 1955. She flipped through her brow, furrowing. Here, she said, finally tapping a page. There's a record a child placed under temporary guardianship at the Whitfield address. Name, Thomas Hale. No date of birth. Notes say, unregistered war orphan relocated by church personnel. He was adopted by a family in 1947, a couple named William and Margaret Miller. Emma's breath caught. Miller. She stared at the name again, heart thudding. Miller, she murmured. As in Jack Miller, Nancy nodded thoughtfully. Well, Clearwater doesn't have many Millers left. My guess is he's one of theirs. William and Margaret had a boy then, grandkids later on. Why, you know them, I think? I do. She thanked Nancy and left her head spinning. The air outside was cold and sharp. The snow from the previous night had melted into slush that reflected the pale sun like glass. She climbed into her truck and just sat there gripping the steering wheel. Her grandmother had hidden a war orphan, and that child had grown into Jack's grandfather. When she drove back to the cabin, the road blurred with memories that weren't hers, but felt like they could have been. She imagined Nora in the same kitchen she now scrubbed clean, whispering to a frightened child as soldiers passed by on the road. The image felt strangely alive, as if her grandmother's courage still pulsed in the walls. Later that afternoon, Jack's truck appeared again at the gate. He stepped out dusted snow from his jacket and looked at her with a half smile. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Maybe I have," she answered softly. "Do you know much about your family?" He frowned. "Not much. My grandfather Will used to say he was lucky to have a second chance at life, but he never said why. My dad didn't ask. Guess we weren't the talking kind." She hesitated, holding his gaze. "Jack, I think my grandmother knew him, maybe even saved him." He looked startled, then skeptical. "What are you talking about?" She showed him the letter and the photo she'd found beside it, a grainy picture of Nora standing with a small boy in front of the cabin. The child's face was blurred by age, but Jack's eyes, gray steady, seemed to echo it. He took the photo carefully, as if afraid it would crumble. "My grandfather had this same scar," he murmured, tracing a faint line near the child's eyebrow. "He said it came from falling on ice when he was little." Guess maybe that wasn't the whole story. For a long moment, neither spoke. The house creaked quietly around them, the fire in the stove snapping. Finally, Jack said, "She saved him. That means she saved me, too." Emma nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think that's why this place feels like it's waiting for something. Maybe it's waiting for us." From that day, they worked side by side to restore what had been lost. Emma cleared the weeds from the front yard, revealing the outline of the old flower beds where Nora once planted lilies and marigolds. Jack replaced the broken porch beams, his movements patient, deliberate. When she thanked him, he just shrugged and said, "Consider it family business." Word of the renovation began to spread through Clearwater. A few days later, a group of college students arrived in a rusted van, parking on the dirt road, with music blaring softly from their speakers. The leader was Ryan Carter, a tall, lanky 20-year-old with a mop of sandy hair and a grin that could light up a room. He was studying environmental design in Missoula and had heard from Maggie at the lumber yard about the girl restoring her grandma's house in the woods. "Thought you could use some hands," he said cheerfully, offering Emma a cup of hot cocoa from a thermos. "We're on winter break, and my folks live nearby. Figured we'd trade labor for cookies." The others followed 3 girls and 2 boys, each one bundled in mismatched coats and scarves, their cheeks pink from the cold. There was Chloe, a quiet art student with green eyes and paint-stained gloves, and Ben, a stocky engineering major who carried a toolbox like it was an extension of his arm. Emma laughed, a sound she hadn't made in weeks. "I don't have cookies yet," she said, "but I can make sandwiches." For the first time since her return, the house was alive with voices and laughter. The students scraped paint from walls, hammered nails, and turned the once silent yard into a hum of movement. Jack, though gruff at first, eventually joined them, showing Ben how to align a frame and teasing Ryan for using the wrong end of a hammer. As the days passed, the kitchen began to take shape again. Emma painted the walls a soft cream and uncovered a box of her grandmother's handwritten recipes: apple cobbler, chicken stew, cornbread. Each one was smudged with flour and thyme. She copied them carefully into a notebook. Someday, she whispered, "We'll feed people here again." One evening, after the students had gone, Jack lingered by the doorway while Emma cleaned brushes. The lamplight flickered across his face. "You're turning this place into something more than a house," he said quietly. "It's starting to feel like home." Emma smiled faintly. That's what she wanted, a home for anyone who needs one. He looked around the room, the fresh paint gleaming, the scent of sawdust and bread mingling in the air. Guess we both needed one. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and endless. The lights of the cabin glowed warm against the white. Emma stood at the window, watching it settle on the fields her grandmother once tended, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. The thaw came slowly that year, as if the mountains themselves were reluctant to release their hold on winter. By early March, the snow began to melt in thin silver ribbons down the hillside, soaking into the black earth. The air smelled of pine resin and thawing soil. Emma Reed stood on the front porch of the restored cabin, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the world wake up again. The roof no longer leaked, the porch boards were new, and the garden, once tangled and colorless, now waited beneath frost for spring to arrive. For the first time, the cabin felt whole. Inside the walls gleamed with fresh paint, the floors sanded and polished by weeks of effort. The laughter of the students who had helped still seemed to echo faintly in the beams. Jack had been by nearly every day since the snow melted, fixing the last few things, a window latch here, a loose board there. They worked mostly in comfortable silence, sometimes breaking into small talk that felt less like conversation and more like two people learning to breathe again. But that morning the silence felt heavier. A thick envelope lay on the table by the window, bearing the red seal of the Clearwater County Tax Office. Emma had been avoiding opening it since the mail truck had dropped it off 2 days earlier. Now she finally did. The words hit her like a blow. Notice of property seizure. Unpaid taxes outstanding. Since 1989, the total owed was far beyond anything she could pay, a remnant of debts left behind after her grandmother's passing. She set the letter down with shaking hands. Jack found her still at the table when he walked in. "You look like someone stole your coffee," he said lightly, before his expression shifted. "What's wrong?" She handed him the paper without a word. His eyes moved over the lines, and when he finished, he exhaled sharply. "Damn it! I didn't even know there were unpaid taxes," Emma said, her voice trembling. I thought the house was just abandoned." "Not they let the records sleep for decades sometimes," Jack said quietly. "But when land starts showing value again, they wake up." She sank into the chair. "If they take it, it's like she dies all over again." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, pacing. "We'll think of something. I'll go talk to the county office, maybe get them to extend it." "They won't care about me, Jack," she said bitterly. "I'm just a waitress with a broken house and big dreams." He looked at her, then really looked, and the quiet conviction in his eyes startled her. "Not just a waitress. You turned a ruin into a home again. That counts for something." That afternoon they drove into Clearwater together. The tax office sat between the diner and the library, an old brick building with blinds drawn halfway down. The clerk behind the counter was Mr. Harold Briggs, a tall man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and a habit of polishing his glasses every few minutes. He spoke in the slow official tone of someone who had learned to turn empathy into paperwork. "Miss Reed," he said, flipping through her file, "I understand this is difficult, but the property's delinquent. You've got 45 days before it goes to auction unless the balance is paid in full." "Can I make payments?" she asked. Hope flickering. "Not under county policy for inherited property. The debt's too old." Jack's jaw tightened. "How much are we talking?" Briggs named the number. It might as well have been a mountain. When they left, the air outside felt colder than when they'd entered. Emma walked in silence to the truck. Jack didn't say a word either, but the muscle in his jaw worked like a man grinding against fate itself. That night, Emma sat by the kitchen table, the old journal of her grandmother open beside her. The pages still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. "If I can't build a world that's kind," Nora had written, "I can at least feed the hungry part of it." Feed. The word pulsed through her. She turned toward the stove, the counter, the smell of flour and wood. Maybe she couldn't save the house by fighting the system. But she could do what Nora did best, open the door. By dawn, her plan was forming. She called Maggie at the lumber yard first. "I need your help," she said, "and maybe a few tables." By noon, half of Clearwater knew. The news spread faster than wildfire. The Whitfield cabin was reopening, not as a home, but as a place for everyone. 3 days later, the porch buzzed with life. The college students returned in their paint-splattered coats, carrying folding chairs and boxes of donated mugs. Old neighbors brought sacks of flour and jars of jam. Even Rick Jack's teasing coworker arrived with a new signboard that read, "Nora's Table. Everyone's welcome." Emma had painted the name herself on the window pane in soft white letters. The place smelled of cinnamon and apple pie. On opening day, people lined up outside, faces pink from the wind laughter cutting through the crisp air. Inside, she moved from table to table with trays of soup and bread, the same recipes her grandmother had written decades before. Jack watched from the corner, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. There was pride in his eyes, but also something quieter, a distance Emma couldn't name. When the last customers left that evening, she found him outside by the truck. "You should be proud," he said. "You built something good here." "We built it," she replied. "Together." He smiled faintly. "Yeah." She studied him, noticing how his eyes lingered on the dark line of the forest beyond the yard. "You're leaving, aren't you?" He didn't deny it. "There's something I've got to take care of." "Jack." He reached into his pocket and pressed something into her hand, a folded receipt, the kind from a vehicle sale. She looked down, reading the words. "Vehicle 2005 Ford F-150, sold for $6,200. Her heart dropped. "You didn't." He shrugged. "It wasn't doing much good sitting in the yard. Figured metal can't matter more than memories." "Jack, that's everything you had," maybe he said quietly. "But you needed this more. Consider it a loan I'll never collect." And before she could speak again, he was gone, driving away in an old borrowed pickup that coughed smoke into the fading light. For a week, Emma threw herself into work. Nora's Table became the heartbeat of the valley. Every morning she baked bread before sunrise, her hair tied up her apron dusted in flour. Maggie stopped by daily to help serve coffee. The college kids came on weekends, still calling her Chef Reed. Word spread fast. People drove from neighboring towns to eat the meals that felt like home. Yet each evening, when the last light faded, Emma would glance at the empty spot beside the porch where Jack's truck once parked. Then, one quiet evening, as she was locking up headlights, flared through the trees. She froze. The truck that pulled in was familiar, not Jack's, but one that looked just like it. The driver stepped out. It was him, dusty and tired, but smiling. "You can't run a cafe without decent lumber shelves," he said, patting the back of the truck bed where planks of oak lay stacked. "Consider this my return policy." Emma laughed, tears blurring her eyes. "You came back. I told you can't stay away from good coffee." That night, under the warm glow of the lamps, they sat side by side at the counter, sipping cocoa in silence. The sound of wind outside mingled with faint music from the radio, and Emma thought of all the hands that had built this, not just hers or Jack's, but her grandmother's Maggie's, the students, even strangers, who had given what little they could. Hope, she realized, wasn't built in one day. It was rebuilt every time someone chose to believe again. The morning sun over Clearwater was softer than usual, diffused through thin spring clouds that glowed like brushed silver. The mountains were still capped with snow, but the valley had begun to green, the first shy colors of April threading through the grass. A faint scent of lilac drifted down from the hills, mingling with the aroma of coffee and cinnamon that floated out from the porch of Nora's Table. Emma Reed stood at the front door, her apron neatly tied, her brown hair pulled into a loose braid. Her cheeks were flushed from the morning rush, but her eyes, hazel and bright, carried a calm glow that no storm could dim now. Around her the small cafe buzzed with voices, laughter, the scrape of chairs, the gentle chime of spoons against mugs. The place was alive, truly alive, in a way it hadn't been in decades. The new roof, freshly painted beams, and light curtains made the room glow with warmth. On one wall hung framed photos of her grandmother Nora, one of her kneading dough on the old counter, another of her standing outside the cabin, arms folded proudly. Beneath the photos, a small chalkboard read, "Be kind, be fed, be home." Maggie tore as ever. The motherly whirlwind moved from table to table, balancing plates. She wore her usual turquoise earrings and a smile wide enough to brighten even the most tired customer. "Table 3 wants more coffee," she called to Emma, who turned with practiced grace to refill the pot. "Got it," Emma said, voice steady and light. At the far corner, the college students, Ryan, Chloe, and Ben, were busy stringing up handmade paper lanterns they had crafted from recycled jars and colored tissue. The light bounced off them like fireflies caught in daylight. Ryan flashed Emma a grin. "Told you this place would be full on opening day." She smiled back. "Remind me to put you on marketing next semester." The bell over the door jingled as another group came in, townsfolk, travelers, families, drawn by the scent and the story that had spread across Clearwater. Word had traveled fast. The old Whitfield cabin had been reborn, not as a home for one family, but for anyone who needed warmth food or a place to sit and be remembered. As the noon crowd swelled, Emma barely noticed the truck pulling up outside. It wasn't until Maggie tapped her shoulder that she looked toward the door. "Someone's here to see you," Maggie whispered, smiling in that knowing way that only women who've seen too many love stories unfold can manage. Emma turned, and there he was, Jack Miller, standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by sunlight. He looked leaner than before, the lines around his gray eyes deeper, his blonde hair a little longer. He wore a denim jacket dusted with the road and held something wrapped in brown paper under his arm. For a heartbeat, the clatter of the cafe faded, replaced by the quiet drum of her pulse. Then Jack smiled, small and real. "Heard there was a grand opening," he said. Emma found her voice. "You're late. We've already run out of apple pie." "Then I guess I'll have to settle for coffee." Laughter rippled around them, lightening the air. She stepped forward, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "You came back. Told you I would." He unwrapped the package, revealing an old wooden frame. Inside was a black and white photograph, Nora young and bright-eyed, standing beside a small boy clutching a loaf of bread. The same photograph Emma had once found half buried in the cellar, now restored and cleaned. The inscription below read, "For kindness that saved a life." Jack set it gently on the counter. "That boy was my grandfather," he said softly. He never forgot her. Said she was the reason he believed in people again. Guess I wanted her to be here today, too. Emma felt tears rise, but she blinked them away, smiling through the ache in her throat. "She is here." Jack nodded, once his eyes glinting in the morning light. "Then let's make it official." They stepped outside together, where the townsfolk had gathered in the yard. Someone had tied ribbons across the new porch rails. The air smelled of wood sugar and new beginnings. Ryan handed them a pair of oversized scissors, grinning. "Go on, Miss Reed. Do the honors." Emma looked at Jack. "You helped build this place. We cut it together." He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. They each held a handle blades crossing the ribbon. For a second time seemed to still the wind, pausing the sun resting softly on the roof. Then the ribbon fell, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Children clapped, old men raised their coffee cups, and Maggie wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. The sound filled the valley laughter applause, the heartbeat of something reborn. Later, as dusk fell, the crowd lingered under the strings of lanterns. The porch became a place of stories. People spoke of Nora and her quiet generosity, of the way the house had waited patiently for love to return. Inside, Emma brewed one last pot of coffee, the smell of roasted beans wrapping the room like a hug. She brought a cup to Jack, who sat near the window where the moonlight spilled across the counter. A stray dog, a black shepherd mix with bright amber eyes, had wandered in during the evening and now lay sleeping at his feet. Emma crouched to pet it, smiling. "Looks like we've got our first regular." Jack chuckled. "Every good place needs a guardian. He needs a name." Jack thought for a moment. "How about chance, chance?" she repeated, rubbing the dog's fur. "Yeah, feels right." The dog wagged its tail in lazy agreement. As the last guest drifted home, Emma walked to the corner table by the fireplace, the one she had reserved just for her grandmother. On it sat a single candle and Nora's old recipe journal, now bound with new leather. She opened to the final blank page and picked up her pen. Her handwriting was steadier now, firm but gentle. "You built this house from wood and love. I only continued to keep its light alive with gratitude." She set down the pen and leaned back, letting the quiet fill her. The fire crackled, the dog stirred, and outside wind whispered through the pines. Jack approached and stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "You did it, Emma." "No," she said softly. "We did." He smiled, the kind of smile that reached deep, the kind that said, "We're home now." The two of them watched as lanterns swayed outside, their light reflecting off the windows, hundreds of small, trembling stars caught in the glass. Somewhere the radio played a slow, gentle tune, a song about staying when the world tells you to go. And in that moment, the cabin, once a hollow relic of the past, felt whole. A place that had been lost had found them both. The mountains stood silent under the moon, as if guarding this small miracle of human hands and hearts. Nora's table glowed warm against the dark, a beacon in the valley, a place where no one was turned away hungry, where every stranger could sit and remember that kindness still lived in the world. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or shining light. They come quietly through kindness, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. Just like Emma and Jack, when we open our doors and hearts to others, God turns broken walls into blessings. Every small act of love is a piece of His work, a reminder that faith can rebuild what despair once destroyed. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never lost. Leave a comment below and write Amen if you believe that God still performs miracles through ordinary people. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of grace, redemption, and second chances, and may God bless you and your home today and always.